What is the price of a woman's life? For Evangeline Hayes, the cost was her father's ruin, payable only by a forced marriage to a man whose touch she dreaded. She stood at the altar, a sacrificial lamb, her future dissolving into grey. But when the moment came to vow obedience, she chose defiance. In one shocking moment, she ripped the veil from her head, a public declaration of her refusal. The chapel gasped. Her father paled. But from the shadows stepped a man no one expected, the formidable Duke of Althorn. He picked up the ruined veil, his cold eyes missing nothing, and did the unthinkable. The scent of dying lilies and damp stone filled the small private chapel. It was a cold morning, and the grey light that filtered through the stained glass did nothing to warm the scene. Evangeline Hayes stood at the altar, her body rigid in a gown of ivory silk that felt more like a shroud. The lace veil, a priceless heirloom, suffocated her. It was the only item of value her family had left. Beside her, Lord Barnaby Finch shifted his considerable weight. He was a man twice her father's age, with a damp-palmed grip and eyes that had already undressed her 1,000 times. A low, wheezing sound escaped him as he breathed. He was her family's salvation. He was her personal damnation. Her father, Viscount Hayes, sat in the front pew, his head bowed. He was a good man, undone by a weakness for cards. Lord Finch, his primary creditor, had made him an offer. "Your debts are forgiven," Finch had said, his thin lips curling, "in exchange for your daughter's hand." It was a bargain that had cost Evangeline everything. "We are gathered here," the vicar began, his voice droning, "to join this man and this woman." Evangeline's gaze drifted past the altar. There were only a dozen guests, Finch's boorish cousins, her own weeping mother, and 2 figures standing in the deep shadows near the entrance. She hadn't noticed them before. One was tall, impossibly so, and stood with a stillness that was more intimidating than any movement. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his presence. He was a stranger, yet his outline was sharp and severe, like a blade. "In holy matrimony," the vicar continued, "if any person present knows of any just cause or impediment, why these two should not be joined." This was it. Her last moment. She thought of her younger brother, Thomas, safe at school, his tuition paid by this very arrangement. She thought of her mother, who would not be homeless. She thought of her father, saved from debtor's prison. She was the price. "I will," a voice inside her screamed. The vicar cleared his throat, ready to proceed. "Then I ask you, Barnaby, to take Evangeline's hand." Lord Finch reached for her, his fingers damp and hot. As his skin was about to touch hers, something inside Evangeline snapped. It was not a scream. It was a rip. With a sudden, violent motion, she reached up, grabbed the lace veil with both hands, and tore it from the combs in her hair. The sound of tearing silk echoed in the silent chapel like a gunshot. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Her mother cried out, "Evangeline, no!" Lord Finch recoiled, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "You little—" "I will not," Evangeline whispered, the words tearing from her raw throat. She threw the tattered veil to the cold stone floor. "I will not." "Insolence!" Finch snarled, raising a hand. "Stop!" The word was not a shout, but it cut through the chaos with the finality of a guillotine. The tall figure stepped out of the shadows. Silence fell, absolute and heavy. The man moved with a lethal, fluid grace, his polished boots making no sound on the stone floor. He was dressed in black, a stark column of night against the chapel's pale interior. As he drew closer, the light caught the severe planes of his face, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the colour of a winter storm. This was no mere guest. This was Grayson Thorne, the Duke of Althorn, a man who owned half the county, a recluse spoken of only in whispers. He was known as the Silent Duke, a man of immense power and devastating control. He did not look at Lord Finch. He did not look at the vicar. His gaze was fixed entirely on Evangeline. He reached the altar steps and paused, his eyes falling to the ruined lace at her feet. Slowly, deliberately, he bent and picked it up. He held the two torn pieces in his hand, inspecting them as if they were a curiosity. Finch, emboldened by his own indignation, stepped forward. "Your Grace, this is a private matter. The girl is hysterical. She is to be my wife." The Duke's head lifted. He turned his cold grey eyes on Lord Finch, and for the first time, Finch seemed to realize his own insignificance. He visibly shrank. "She is not," the Duke said, his voice a low rumble. He turned back to Evangeline. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the aftermath of her own rebellion. He stood before her, the ruined veil still in his large, gloved hand. He was impossibly close. She could see a small, white scar just at his hairline, a stark contrast to his dark hair. He didn't try to fix the veil. He simply held the largest piece, the part that had covered her face. With a movement so gentle it startled her, he raised his hand. He did not touch her hair, but held the edge of the lace to her temple, as if setting it back in place. It was a gesture of possession, of quiet claiming. He looked deep into her eyes, and the world seemed to narrow to the space of a breath. "He will not have you," Grayson Thorne said, his voice meant for her alone, though it carried to every corner of the chapel. "I will." He lowered his hand and turned to the stunned crowd. "The wedding is cancelled," he announced. He then looked at Lord Hayes. "Your debt to Lord Finch has been transferred. It is now owed to me, and I, Your Grace, always collect." He offered his arm to Evangeline. "Come." It was not a request. It was a command. She was trading one cage for another, but as she looked at Lord Finch's apoplectic face and then at the Duke's impenetrable one, she knew that for the first time in months, she could breathe. She placed her hand on his arm. The vestry was a small, cramped room, smelling of old wax and mildew. It was here the Duke led Evangeline, his grip firm on her elbow, his man-at-arms, the second, shorter figure from the shadows, barring the door behind them. The sound of Lord Finch's apoplectic shouting could be heard through the thick oak. "This is an outrage, an abduction. I will have the law on him." "Let him," the Duke said to no one in particular. He released Evangeline, who immediately crossed to the small, grimy window, rubbing her arms. The door burst open, and Lord Hayes stumbled in, his face the colour of ash. "Your Grace, I don't understand. What is the meaning of this? My arrangement with Lord Finch is void," the Duke stated. He turned from the window he had been staring out of. "I am a partner in the bank that holds your notes. This morning I purchased them. All of them." Lord Hayes swayed. "Then I'm ruined. Utterly." "Not at all." Grayson Thorne moved to the small table where the vicar signed certificates. He produced a leather satchel, which he placed on the table with a heavy thud. From it, he pulled a sheaf of papers. "Your debt remains. The collateral, however, has changed." "The collateral?" Lord Hayes repeated, his voice faint. The Duke's gaze slid to Evangeline. She froze, the cold from the window seeping into her. "The arrangement you made with Lord Finch was for your daughter's hand," the Duke said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The terms of the debt remain the same. The creditor has simply changed." Evangeline stepped away from the window. "What are you saying?" "I am saying, Miss Hayes," the Duke replied, his eyes meeting hers, "that your father's freedom will be purchased by you, just as you had planned." The breath left her in a rush. No, you can't. That's barbaric. It is business, the Duke countered. Finch would have taken you, and he would have continued to bleed your father dry. I am offering a single, clean transaction. You are offering slavery, she shot back, her fear replaced by a sudden, hot anger. You stopped one monstrous marriage only to propose another? A flicker of something crossed his face. It was not amusement. It was perhaps recognition. I am proposing an arrangement. Finch would have broken you within a year and discarded your family. I will not. And what will you do? She challenged, stepping closer. Lock me away in your castle. Keep me as some sort of collateral? Yes, he said simply, without a trace of malice. It was a statement of fact. You will be my wife. You will be the Duchess of Althorn. In return, your father's debts are cleared, his lands will be returned, and your family's name will be restored. You will want for nothing. Except my freedom, she whispered. You had no freedom at that altar, he said, his voice softening just a fraction. You had only a cell. I am offering you a larger one, a gilded one to be sure, but a different one. Lord Hayes, seeing his salvation, fell to his knees. Your Grace, you are a generous man, a saint. Evangeline, child, thank the Duke. Thank him. Get up, father, Evangeline said, her voice shaking with disgust. She turned back to Grayson Thorne. And if I refuse? The Duke's expression hardened. Then I will call your father's notes. By sunset, he will be in Newgate. Your mother and brother will be on the street. Your choice. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. There was only a change of masters. She looked at her father, a weak man she loved, who was now weeping with relief. She looked at the Duke, a powerful man she did not know, who looked at her as if she were a column in a ledger. I see, she said. She lifted her chin, the last bastion of her pride. I will need terms. The Duke raised an eyebrow. My family. You will not hold this over them. The debt is paid. They are to be left in peace. Their lands restored, as you said. Done, he agreed. My brother's education. He will continue at Harrow and then to Cambridge. His finances will be secured, independent of my father. A wise provision, the Duke said, nodding. It will be done. And me? She faltered, not knowing what to ask for. What could she ask for? I will be your Duchess, but I will not be your property. The Duke was silent for a long moment. He walked to the door and opened it. The vicar stood there, wringing his hands, with Lord Finch being physically restrained by the Duke's man-at-arms. Lord Finch! The Duke called out. The man stopped struggling, his eyes wild. You will leave. Now. If you ever come within 20 miles of the Hayes estate or any property belonging to me, I will see you ruined in a way that makes debtor's prison look like a holiday. Finch, defeated, deflated. He spat on the ground and was hauled away. The Duke turned back into the room. He faced the vicar. You will perform a ceremony. Now. But your Grace, the vicar stammered. The banns have not been read. I have a special license from the Archbishop himself, the Duke said, producing another document. We will be married. Today. He looked at Evangeline. The finality of it crushed her. My father and my mother. They will be the witnesses, she said, her voice hollow. As you wish. He stepped back, holding the door open. He had not answered her last demand. He had not agreed that she would not be his property. He didn't need to. By marrying her, by paying for her, the law said she would be. The first wedding was a tragedy. The second was a farce. It took less than 10 minutes. Evangeline and Grayson stood before the altar, the ruined veil still lying on the floor. Her father stood as witness, his relief palpable. Her mother was fetched, her face a mask of confusion and terror. Evangeline spoke her vows in a clear, cold voice. The Duke's voice was a low, steady counterpoint. When he slid the ring on her finger, it was not a thin gold band, but a heavy, square-cut emerald, cold and heavy. It felt like a shackle. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Duke did not kiss her. He simply took her hand again and placed it on his arm. "Mrs. Hayes, Lord Hayes," he said, nodding to her parents. "My condolences on the loss of your daughter. My congratulations on the restoration of your fortune." He turned and led his new Duchess out of the chapel into the cold grey morning and toward a waiting carriage that bore the Althorn crest. She did not look back. The carriage ride was 4 hours. It was 4 hours of absolute, suffocating silence. Evangeline sat opposite her new husband, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. The emerald on her finger felt alien and cold. The Duke, Grayson Thorne, did not look at her. He stared out the window, his profile unforgiving, as the rolling hills of the countryside gave way to the sharp, brooding mountains of the north. She tried, once. "Where are we going?" "Home," he replied, without turning his head. "And where is home?" "Althorn Castle." The name settled in the air between them, heavy and final. Althorn, a place of legend. It was said the original stones were set by the Romans, and that the castle itself was a place of deep shadows and old sorrows. When they finally arrived, dusk was painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The castle was not a building, it was a fortress. It rose from the cliffside, as if carved from the stone itself, a defiant fist against the sky. It was magnificent, and it was the most terrifying thing Evangeline had ever seen. The carriage clattered into a vast courtyard. Servants lined the steps, a silent, unmoving row of grey and black. They were perfectly still, their faces blank. The Duke descended and offered her his hand. His touch was impersonal, a mere formality. As she stepped down, a woman in a severe black dress, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice thin and sharp. "The castle is prepared." "Mrs. Davies," the Duke acknowledged. "This is the Duchess." Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, turned her eyes on Evangeline. It was not a look of welcome. It was a look of assessment, of cold, calculating judgment. And Evangeline felt, quite suddenly, that she had been found wanting. "Your Grace," the housekeeper curtsied, her spine barely bending. "The Duchess will be tired," Grayson said. "Show her to her rooms." "Of course," Mrs. Davies turned. "This way, Your Grace." Evangeline looked at her husband, expecting him to follow, to say something. He was already speaking to his man-at-arms, his back to her. He had delivered his package, and he was done. "My things," Evangeline began. "Your things from your father's home have not arrived," Mrs. Davies said, a hint of a sneer in her voice. "A suitable wardrobe has been provided." Evangeline followed the housekeeper into the cavernous great hall. Suits of armor stood sentinel in the shadows, and tapestries depicting brutal hunting scenes hung from the walls. Their footsteps echoed, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. They climbed a grand staircase and turned left, down a long, draughty corridor. "These will be your rooms," Mrs. Davies announced, pushing open a heavy oak door. "The east wing." The rooms were extraordinary. A large sitting room with a fireplace already crackling, a bedroom larger than her entire family's drawing room, and a dressing room stocked with gowns in silk, velvet, and muslin. It was a queen's ransom. "The Duke's rooms are in the main tower," Mrs. Davies said, her hand on the door. "He will not be joining you." Evangeline felt a bizarre, unwelcome flicker of relief, quickly followed by humiliation. She was a wife in name, a bride bought and stored, like a piece of art. "And that," Evangeline said, pointing to a heavy door at the far end of the corridor they had just walked down. "Where does that lead?" A shadow passed over Mrs. Davies's face. "That is the West Wing, Your Grace." "And?" "It is closed," the housekeeper said, her voice flat. "It has been closed for years. The Duke's orders. No one is to enter. No one." There was a finality to her tone that warned against further questions. "Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Davies said. "A maid will be sent to help you dress." She curtsied, her back stiff, and left, pulling the door closed with a soft, ominous click. Evangeline was alone. She walked to the window. The view was of a sheer drop, the rocks below dashed by a churning sea. She was on an island, or perhaps a peninsula. She was trapped. She sank onto the silk chaise, the wealth of the room pressing in on her. She had been purchased, she had been installed, and now she had been abandoned. Dinner was a silent, agonizing affair. She and the Duke sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 40. Servants moved like ghosts, placing and removing dishes she barely touched. Grayson Thorne ate with a focused, mechanical precision. He did not speak. Finally, she could stand it no more. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice sounding too loud in the vast room. He paused, his wine glass halfway to his lips. "Do what?" "Today. Why me? You could have ruined Finch without this." She gestured around the room. "You could have bought my father's debt and sent me home. Why marry me?" He set the glass down. His grey eyes met hers down the length of the table. "Hawthorne needs an heir. I require a duchess. You were available." The cold, brutal honesty of it was worse than any lie. "You were a suitable solution to a pressing problem, Miss Hayes, or rather, Your Grace." "A solution," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Like a brood mare." He did not deny it. "The Hawthorne line must continue. I was married once before. It did not end well." This was the first personal detail he had offered. "What happened?" "My first wife, Eliza, is dead." His voice was flat, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. "It is not a subject I wish to discuss. Ever." He stood, throwing his napkin onto the table. "You have your rooms. You have your title. The estate is complex. I would advise you not to trouble yourself with its affairs." "And what am I to trouble myself with?" she asked, rising to meet his gaze. "The color of the drapes? The placement of the flowers?" "That would be a start," he said. He looked at her for a moment, a long, unreadable appraisal. "The East Wing is yours. The library is at your disposal. The grounds within reason. You will stay out of the West Wing. You will not ask questions about my first wife, and you will perform your duties as Duchess when I require it. Is that clear?" He was setting the terms of her imprisonment. "And if I do not agree?" "You already have," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." He turned and walked out of the dining hall, his footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the immense, oppressive silence of Hawthorne Castle. Evangeline was left standing alone, a duchess in name, a prisoner in truth, and for the first time she began to wonder what had happened to the first duchess in the forbidden West Wing. The days at Hawthorne bled into one another, a monotonous march of fog, silence, and duty. Evangeline's life was dictated by bells, a bell for rising, a bell for breakfast, which she took alone, a bell for dinner, which she took with the Duke in suffocating silence. Grayson was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days locked in his study or riding out across the moors, returning only after dark. He was, as he had promised, a husband in name only. He never touched her. He rarely spoke to her. But his presence and his rules were everywhere, especially the one rule she could not forget: stay out of the West Wing. It was a command that only fanned the flames of her curiosity. The door to the wing was at the end of the long gallery, a heavy, iron-banded thing. It was locked. Mrs. Davies, she observed, was the only one who carried the key. The housekeeper wore it on a thick chatelaine at her waist, a cluster of iron keys that jangled like a jailer's. Evangeline tried to be the duchess he wanted. She met with the cook, reviewed the menus, and attempted to manage the household. It was here she met her first and most formidable obstacle: Mrs. Davies. "The ledgers, Mrs. Davies?" Evangeline asked one morning, sitting in the small morning room she had claimed as her own. "I would like to review the household accounts." "That will not be necessary, Your Grace," Mrs. Davies replied, not bothering to look up from her mending. "The Duke prefers I handle the finances." "The Duke may prefer it, but I am the Duchess, and I will see them." The ledgers, when they were finally produced, were a mess. Or rather, they were too neat. There were vast sums allocated to supplies and maintenance that seemed exorbitant, even for a castle this size. But the most curious entry was a regular, large payment to a B.F. Evangeline's blood ran cold. B.F. Barnaby Finch? It couldn't be. Was her husband still paying the man he had thwarted? She needed to understand the man she had married. She went to the library, a magnificent two-story room, and began to search. Not for books on economics, but for a history of Althorn, a history of her husband. She found very little. Grayson Thorne had inherited the title 5 years prior, following the death of his elder brother. He had married a year later, Eliza Delamere. There was one small portrait of her in a society gazette. She was beautiful, with pale blonde hair and a fragile, almost ethereal smile. The gazette mentioned their fairy tale wedding. 2 years later, a small, terse announcement: "The Duchess of Althorn has passed. She leaves no issue, no cause of death, no details, just gone." It was then that Evangeline started to hear the sounds. It only happened late at night, when the wind screamed around the castle turrets. It was a faint sound, elusive. At first, she thought it was the wind itself, or the sea. But as she lay awake in her grand, empty bed, she realized it was something else. It was music, a high, thin melody, like a music box, and beneath it, someone crying. The sounds came from the end of the hall, from the locked door, from the West Wing. Evangeline got out of bed, her heart hammering. She crept down the cold corridor, her bare feet silent on the stone. She pressed her ear to the thick oak door. It was true. She could hear it, a tinkling, repetitive melody, and the unmistakable sound of a woman's quiet, desperate sobbing. A cold, primal fear seized her. A ghost? Was the castle haunted by the first, tragic Duchess? She fled back to her room, her mind racing. Grayson had said Eliza was dead. Mrs. Davies had said the wing was closed. They were lying. The next day, she sought out a maid, a young girl named Mary, who seemed less terrified of her than the others. Evangeline found her in the linen closet. "Mary," Evangeline said, keeping her voice casual, "I am curious about the castle's history. The West Wing, it seems so sad, to have it all closed up." Mary's face went pale. "Oh no, Your Grace, we don't talk about that. It's a sad place." "Why?" Evangeline pressed gently. "The first Duchess," Mary whispered, looking over her shoulder. "She was not well. After the baby?" Evangeline's breath caught. Baby? There was a baby? Stillborn, Your Grace. A boy. After that, she changed. Mary's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and pity. They say she went mad. She loved her music box. Mary looked terrified, as if she had said too much. She died there, Your Grace, in that wing. Some say she never left. A baby? A stillborn son. Evangeline's mind reeled. Althorn needs an heir. His words came back to her, now dripping with a new, tragic meaning. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his son. That night, she confronted him at their silent dinner. You told me your wife was dead, Evangeline said, her voice shaking slightly. You didn't tell me you had a child, a son. Grayson's fork clattered onto his plate. He rose from the table, his face a mask of thunder. I told you, he bit out. That subject is not to be discussed. How can it not be? She cried, standing to face him. This whole castle, it's a tomb. It's a shrine to her. I hear her, Grayson. I hear her crying at night. I hear her music box. His head snapped up. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a stark, terrifying emptiness. What? He said, his voice deadly soft. Did you say? I hear her, Evangeline repeated, quieter now. From the West Wing. I know she's dead, but there are whispers. They say she haunts it. They say she's still there. The Duke stared at her, and for the first time she saw not coldness, not anger, but a raw, agonizing pain. He looked like a man being flayed alive. You hear a music box? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Yes, and crying. He didn't speak. He turned and strode from the room, his long legs carrying him quickly. Evangeline, driven by a force she didn't understand, ran after him. He was not going to his study. He was not going to his tower. He was walking down the long gallery. He was walking like a man in a trance toward the locked, forbidden door of the West Wing. He stopped in front of it, his shoulders rigid. Grayson? She said, her voice small. He didn't turn. You will go back to your room. Now, Evangeline. It was the first time he had used her given name. I will not. What is in there? If it's a ghost, I am not afraid. But if it is not... He turned to her, his face haggard in the moonlight, streaming through the gallery window. The only ghosts in this castle, Your Grace, are the ones we carry with us. From behind the door, faint but clear, the music box played its tinny, sad tune. Grayson Thorne's face, the face of the silent Duke, crumpled. He leaned his forehead against the iron-banded door, his eyes squeezed shut, a single hoarse sound escaping his throat. It was not a word. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. And Evangeline realized the truth. She's not dead, is she? She whispered, the words hanging in the air. You didn't lose your wife. You lost your mind. She's in there. You've kept her locked in there. The music box played on, a lullaby for the damned. The Duke turned from the door, his face remade into the cold, unfeeling mask she knew. But she had seen the crack. She had seen the man beneath. You will not, he said, his voice a low command. Speak of this to anyone. So it's true, Evangeline breathed, horrified. You're keeping her prisoner. You know nothing, he snarled, a feral note entering his voice. Go to your room. That is an order. No. Evangeline stood her ground. You bought me. You made me your duchess. You will not order me about like a servant. I am your wife, and I have a right to know the secrets of this house, especially if the secret is another wife. His eyes flashed. She is not my wife, not anymore. The law declared her absent. She is legally dead. But she is not! Evangeline gestured to the door, from which the faint crying could still be heard. She is in there, alive, and you have taken another wife, That is bigamy. That is a sin. It is a necessity, he roared, his control finally shattering. The sheer volume of his voice in the silent gallery made her flinch. The title must be secured. The line must continue. There must be an heir. And she could not provide one, Evangeline finished, the pieces clicking into place. The stillborn son. It drove her mad, and you locked her away and replaced her. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice dropping back to a cold monotone. He looked exhausted. You will never understand the complications. Try me. He looked at her, a long, searching look. Mrs. Davies, he said. She tends to her. Mrs. Davies, Evangeline repeated. The stern housekeeper, the one who hated her, the one with the keys. She's your accomplice, your jailer? She is loyal to Eliza. He ran a hand through his dark hair. It is not what you think. Now, for the last time, leave me. He turned back to the door, his head bowed. He was not a monster. He was a man in his own private hell. But Evangeline had a problem. If Eliza was alive, then her marriage was a sham. She was not a duchess. She was nothing. A mistress, installed in the house under false pretenses. And if that were true, her family was not safe. The agreement was void. She retreated to her room, but not to sleep. She was more trapped than she had ever been. She had to know the truth. Not his truth, but the real one. She had to get into the West Wing. She watched Mrs. Davies for 2 days. The housekeeper was a creature of rigid routine. She went to the West Wing 3 times a day. Once in the morning with a breakfast tray, once at noon with lunch, and once at night with a supper tray and a bottle of something. Laudanum? The keys never left her waist. Evangeline would have to take them. She formed a plan. She went to the ledgers again, to the page with the BF entry. She would create a crisis that only Mrs. Davies could solve. That evening, just before Mrs. Davies was to make her nightly visit, Evangeline found her in the main hall. Mrs. Davies, Evangeline said, her voice calm and authoritative. I was reviewing the ledgers. I have a question about a significant recurring expenditure. One labelled BF. The housekeeper froze. Her hand, which had been adjusting her apron, stilled. I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. I think you do. Evangeline held up the ledger, which she had carried from the library. It's a very large sum. Paid monthly. To a BF, I can only imagine what the Duke would say if he knew his funds were being misappropriated. Mrs. Davies's face, usually so impassive, turned a mottled white. It is not. It is for the castle. Is it? Evangeline said, walking toward the small office off the hall. Then you won't mind coming with me to the Duke's study and explaining this entry to him. He's just returned from his ride. This was a lie. The Duke was still hours away, but Mrs. Davies didn't know that. No, the housekeeper said, her voice sharp with panic. The Duke is busy. He must not be disturbed. He will be more disturbed by theft, Evangeline said, pushing open the office door. After you. Mrs. Davies, trapped, followed her in. The office was small. It is a misunderstanding, Your Grace. Then explain it. Evangeline stood with her back to the door, blocking the exit. The housekeeper, her hands trembling, began a long, convoluted story about a supplier in the village, a man named Benjamin Fields. As she spoke, her hands fluttered at her waist, twisting in her apron, and Evangeline saw what she was doing. Mrs. Davies, in her agitation, was fumbling with her keyring. Benjamin Fields, Evangeline repeated, pretending to consider it. And he requires cash payments in such large amounts? He is a difficult man, Your Grace. I'm sure he is. Evangeline took a step closer. You seem agitated, Mrs. Davies. Perhaps you should sit." The housekeeper was sweating now. "I must attend to my duties." She tried to push past Evangeline. In that moment, Evangeline tripped, stumbling against the housekeeper. The key ring, heavy and iron, was at her hip. In the tangle of limbs and apologies, Evangeline's nimble fingers found the one large, ornate iron key she had seen the housekeeper use. With a practiced motion, born of desperation, she unhooked it from the ring. It was cold in her palm. "Oh, forgive me, Mrs. Davies," Evangeline said, righting herself. "How clumsy." "Your Grace." The housekeeper, now just wanting to escape, bowed stiffly and hurried from the room. She didn't check her keys. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She had the key. She waited an hour until the castle was deep in the quiet of the night. She crept down the long gallery, the heavy key a weight in her hand. The west wing door loomed. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. She cringed, but no one came. She turned it. The tumblers fell, and the heavy door opened with a low groan. She stepped inside. The air was stale and cold. This wing was not like the rest of the castle. It was feminine. The walls were covered in faded rose-patterned silk. The furniture was delicate, French, and covered in dust cloths. It was a tomb, a shrine. She walked down the hall, her hand on the wall. At the very end, a line of light shone from under a door. She heard the music box and the crying. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The room was a nursery, a beautiful, tragic room, filled with toys and a magnificent crib. In the corner, a woman sat in a rocking chair, her back to the door. She was rail-thin, her pale blonde hair hanging in limp, matted strands. She was humming to the music box in her lap. "Eliza?" Evangeline whispered. The woman in the chair did not turn. She kept rocking, humming, and crying. Evangeline stepped further into the room, and she saw it. In the crib, there was not a baby. There was a porcelain doll dressed in antique lace. The woman in the chair was not Eliza. The woman in the chair, her face puffy and stained with tears, was Mrs. Davies. "She's gone," the housekeeper was muttering, rocking the music box. "He took her from me. He locked her away. And then he killed her. My sweet girl. My Eliza." Evangeline froze, a new, far more terrible realization dawning. A hand closed on her shoulder. She spun, a scream in her throat. Grayson Thorne stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold, unbridled fury. "I told you," he hissed, "never to come here." "Where is she?" Evangeline demanded, her voice shaking. "Eliza, where is she?" "She is where she has always been," the Duke said, his voice raw. He pointed past her. Evangeline looked. She had been so focused on the nursery, she hadn't seen the adjoining door. It was open. It was a bedroom. And on the bed, lying perfectly still, her blonde hair spread on the pillow, was a woman. She was pale, her eyes closed. "Is she drugged?" the Duke said, his voice flat. "With the laudanum Mrs. Davies provides, to keep her quiet, to keep her peaceful." "But Mrs. Davies—" Evangeline pointed to the housekeeper, who was still rocking and weeping, lost in her own grief. "Eliza was her mistress," Grayson said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. "But she was more than that. You wanted to know the truth. Here it is." He stepped into the room. Mrs. Davies. "That is enough." The housekeeper didn't look up. "He killed her. He killed my baby." "Mrs. Davies," Grayson said, his voice sharper. "Your sister is resting." Evangeline's head snapped to him. "Sister?" "Eliza was not her mistress," Grayson said, his eyes filled with a pain so old it was part of him. "Eliza Thorne is her daughter." The revelation hung in the air, more chilling than the draft from the hall. "Her daughter," Evangeline repeated, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. "But she's a housekeeper. Eliza was nobility. A Delamere." "Eliza Delamere died when she was 6, Grayson said, his voice a low, heavy monotone. He walked past Evangeline and stood over the rocking housekeeper. "Mrs. Davies, enough." He gently took the music box from her hands. The housekeeper, her ritual broken, finally looked up, her eyes unfocused. "Your Grace, I was just—" "I know," he said. He wasn't speaking to a servant. He was speaking to a grieving mother. Go to your room. I will see to her." Mrs. Davies, looking like a sleepwalker, stumbled to her feet and shuffled out of the room, leaving the three of them, Evangeline, the Duke, and the sleeping form on the bed, in the vast, sad silence. "Explain," Evangeline demanded, though her voice was soft now. Grayson ran a hand over his face. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Her name is not Davies. It was Danvers. She was the nursery governess for the Delamere family. Her own child, an illegitimate daughter named Eliza, was raised in the household, passed off as a distant, poor relation." He walked to the window, staring out into the blackness. "When the real Eliza Delamere died of a fever, the family covered it up. They couldn't bear the loss, the scandal. They substituted her, Mrs. Danvers's daughter. My wife." "My God," Evangeline whispered. "She was an imposter." "She was a victim," Grayson corrected, his voice harsh. "Raised to be someone she wasn't. Fed lies her whole life. When I met her, she was beautiful, fragile and terrified. Terrified someone would find out she wasn't real. Her mother, Mrs. Davies, came with her as her devoted lady's maid, to manage her, to control her." He turned to face Evangeline. The pressure was too much. She was not strong. She was prone to melancholia. When she lost the baby, our son, she shattered. He gestured to the woman on the bed. "This is what was left. She is not mad, not in the way you think. She is broken. She retreated into a world where her baby is still alive, where she is still the perfect duchess. And her mother, Evangeline finished, blames you." "For all of it," Grayson nodded. "For marrying her, for forcing her to produce an heir, for everything. Mrs. Davies believes I drove her daughter to this. She has kept her here, in this shrine, dosing her with laudanum, caring for her. But it's not care. It's preservation. It's penance." "And you let her?" Evangeline was aghast. "You locked your own wife away?" "What would you have had me do?" he lashed out, the pain returning. "Commit her to Bedlam? To an asylum? To be beaten and chained? Here she is safe. She is unaware. Her mother tends to her. It was the only kindness I could offer." "But the money," Evangeline said, her mind flashing back to the ledger. "The BF entry. It wasn't Barnaby Finch." "No." A dark, dangerous look crossed the Duke's face. "It was Blackwell's farm. The asylum I should have sent her to. Mrs. Davies has been extorting me for years. The price of her silence, the price of her care. She's been paying herself, from my accounts, for her trouble." "But Barnaby Finch is her brother," Grayson said, the final ugly piece slotting into place. "Mrs. Davies or Danvers is Barnaby Finch's sister. The whole family is a nest of vipers." Evangeline sank onto a small stool. It was all a lie, a web of lies, so thick it was suffocating. "Finch knew," she realized. "He knew your wife was alive. He knew you needed an heir. He knew you were trapped." "They planned it together," Grayson said, his voice flat. Mrs. Davies fed him the information. Finch bankrupted your father, knowing I was susceptible. He knew I was looking for a solution. He planned to force my hand, to have me marry you, or to expose me for the bigamist I technically am. Either way, he would have leverage. He would own me. Evangeline looked at him, truly looked at him. The silent Duke, the cold, hard man. He was a man trapped in a nightmare, held hostage by his own compassion. "So when you walked into that chapel," she said, "you weren't saving me from Finch." "No," he said, his voice raw. "I was saving myself. I had already been investigating Finch, trying to find a way out. I had seen you. Seen me. Weeks ago, in the village. You were arguing with a shopkeeper about the price of grain. You were magnificent." A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "You were intelligent. You were strong. You are everything this is not." He gestured to the tragic room. "I knew Finch was planning to offer you to me, in a way. I never intended this. But when you tore that veil, I saw the same fire I'd seen in the village. I saw a woman who would not break." He took a step toward her. "I didn't stop the wedding to be a monster. I stopped it because, in that moment, I realized Finch had given me the one thing I needed. A weapon, a partner, a duchess who could fight. I didn't marry you to protect my title, Evangeline. I married you to save it." He had bought her, yes, but not as collateral, as an ally. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. Grayson looked at the woman on the bed, his first wife, his first great tragedy. Then he looked at Mrs. Davies, who was now sobbing in the hallway. "Now," he said, his voice hardening, "the truth comes out. Now, we clean the house." He walked to the bed and looked down at Eliza's face. "She deserves peace. Real peace. Not this living death." He turned to Evangeline, and his eyes were clear for the first time. "I have bound you to a life of secrets and lies, Your Grace, and for that I am truly sorry. But I am asking you to help me end this. Will you?" He was asking, not commanding. "What do you need me to do?" she said. The dawn that broke over Althorn Castle was a new kind of light. It was cold, but it was clear. By morning, Mrs. Davies was gone. Grayson had confronted her, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating finality. He had evidence of her extortion, of her conspiracy with her brother. He gave her a choice, a carriage to a distant convent, where she would live out her days, or prison. She chose the convent. Lord Barnaby Finch was arrested before noon. The Duke's men, armed with the Duke's evidence, found him at his club. He was charged with conspiracy, extortion, and fraud. He would never threaten anyone again. And Eliza, Evangeline had sat with her in the cold, sad room, after the Duke had left to give his orders. She had watched the laudanum wear off. The woman who woke was not a mad woman. She was a gentle, confused, and deeply sad person. She had spoken of her baby, and Evangeline, her heart breaking, had held her hand and listened. Grayson had made arrangements, a private, beautiful sanatorium by the sea, a place of light and air and real doctors. He was sending her there not as a prisoner, but as a patient. He was giving her a chance at a life, one her mother had stolen from her. Evangeline stood in the grand drawing room, the one she had never felt belonged to her, watching the carriage take Eliza away. She felt a profound, aching sadness. The castle was quiet. For the first time, it was not an oppressive silence. It was just quiet. Grayson entered the room, his face etched with exhaustion. He did not look at her, but went to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she replied. He was silent for a full minute. Then He turned to her. Your marriage to me is not valid. It was performed under false pretenses. My wife was alive. You are free, Evangeline. He walked to the desk. I have prepared the documents, an annulment. It will be quiet, discreet. And this. He slid a heavy purse and a deed across the desk. It is a property, in the South, enough to see you and your family live in comfort for the rest of your lives. It is the least, it is all I can offer. She looked at the papers. Her freedom, the freedom she had craved. She could walk away. She could go back to her family. She could be Miss Hayes again. She thought of the cold chapel. She thought of Lord Finch. She thought of this dark, brooding, broken man who had been blackmailed by his own compassion. You are not a monster, Grayson, she said softly. He looked up, surprised. You made a terrible choice, years ago. You tried to protect a woman you pitied, and you were trapped. You did not act without a heart. A heart, he scoffed, a bitter sound. I bought you. I used you as a solution to my problems. And I, she said, walking toward him, used you. I used you to save my family. We were a transaction, a bargain struck in silence. But it is not silent anymore. She reached the fireplace and stood beside him, her small frame a stark contrast to his tall one. You asked for my hand at that altar, she said, looking into the fire, but you never asked me why I tore the veil. He turned to look at her, his grey eyes searching her face. Why? I tore it because it was a lie, she said, meeting his gaze. It was a symbol of my bondage to a man I despised, a future I could not bear. It was an act of finality, of an ending. She reached out and, very gently, touched his hand. He flinched but did not pull away. You set it back, she whispered. You picked up the pieces of that lie, and you offered me a different one. Evangeline, he began, his voice thick. But it is not a lie anymore, she said, her voice gaining strength. Yesterday this was a prison. Today, she looked around the room, which was now filled with morning light. Today it is just a house that needs a mistress, a house that needs a life. She turned to him fully. I will not take your money, your grace. I will not take your annulment. What are you saying? He asked, his voice hoarse. I am saying, she said, a small, tentative smile touching her lips, that Althorn still needs an heir, and you still require a duchess. His face was a mask of disbelief, of a hope he hadn't dared to feel. I will not be the Duchess of the West Wing, she said, her voice firm. I will not be a ghost or a replacement. I will be the Duchess of Althorn, but this time it will be real. Grayson Thorne, the silent duke, looked at this woman, this stranger he had bought, who had seen the very worst of him, who had unearthed all his secrets, and who was still standing here. He took her hand, the one with the heavy emerald ring. He brought it to his lips. His own hand was trembling. The wedding in the chapel, it was a contract, he said. It was not a marriage. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time she saw no shadows, only the man. Evangeline, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Will you stay? Will you be my wife? My true wife? She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to. She had been bought. She had been bartered. But for the first time she was being chosen. And she was choosing, too. Yes, Grayson, she said, her hand warm in his. I will. And so, the story of the silent duke and his defiant duchess truly began. It was not a marriage born of love, but one forged in secrets, truth, and a shared will to survive. The shadows of Althorn Castle were long, but they were no match for the fire Evangeline brought into its walls. She had torn the veil of a life she refused, only to be given a new one by the most unexpected man, a man who, she would come to find, needed saving just as much as she did. Theirs would be a life of challenges, but it would be a life they built together, a true partnership, built on the ashes of the past. Thank you for listening to this dramatic story. If you were captivated by Evangeline's journey and the Duke's secrets, please let us know in the comments. What do you think will happen next for them? We love hearing your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend who loves historical romance, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of drama, passion, and incredible twists. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story.